Somewhere in the mountains between Spain and France, there are people speaking a language that makes absolutely no sense to linguists. Not because it's complicated, not because it's rare, but because it doesn't belong to anything. Every other language in Europe, French, German, Russian, Greek, Hindi, all the way over in India, they're all cousins. They all trace back to one massive family tree called Indo-European, except for one. Euskara, Basque. It just sits there, alone, unrelated to anything else spoken on this planet. Scientists have spent over 200 years trying to find its relatives. They've searched Africa, the Caucasus, even the Americas. Nothing. It's like finding a single tree in a forest that isn't just a different species. It's not even in the same category of plant life. Think about that for a second. Every language around Euskara arrived within the last several thousand years, brought by waves of migration, conquest, trade. Latin swept through and became Spanish, French, Italian, Portuguese. Germanic tribes pushed their languages into Western Europe, but somehow tucked into a small mountainous corner where Spain meets France, one language just stayed put. It didn't get replaced. It didn't evolve into something else. It's still there, still spoken by around 750,000 people today, still stubbornly refusing to fit into any known linguistic family. That's not just unusual, that's basically a linguistic miracle. Now, here's where things get interesting. We're not saying the Basques are some untouched relic frozen in time, a perfect window into prehistoric Europe. That's the romantic version, and it's mostly myth. But we are saying something else is true, something backed by genetics, by history, by the language itself. The Basques might be the closest thing we have to living survivors of a Europe that existed before Indo-European languages ever arrived. A Europe we barely understand anymore because almost everything from that world got erased, replaced, or absorbed. Over the next while, we're going deep into this mystery. We'll look at what the Romans wrote about the tribes living in this region 2,000 years ago. We'll examine lost scripts from ancient Spain that some researchers think might be distant cousins of Basque, though the evidence is far shakier than people online want you to believe. We'll dig into what modern genetics actually says about Basque origins, and just as importantly, what it doesn't say. Because DNA and language are not the same thing, and mixing them up has led to some seriously flawed theories over the decades. Before we get into it, if you're listening to this while trying to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these. So subscribe maybe, and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is right now. I love checking the comments and seeing London at midnight, Toronto at lunch, Sydney at sunrise, all at the same time. If you want this without any music or ads interrupting the flow, follow me on Spotify, links in the description, and if you've got 30 seconds, a 5-star review helps this channel more than you'd think. Now let's go back, way back, before Rome, before Christianity, before most of what we consider ancient history even began. Because to understand why Basque doesn't fit, we need to understand the world it somehow survived. So where exactly are we talking about? Picture the spot where Spain and France meet the Atlantic. That green, folded corner of Western Europe, where the Pyrenees start climbing up from the coastline. That's the Basque Country. Not a single nation on any modern map, but a cultural region stretching across 7 historical territories, 4 of them in Spain, Biscaya, Guipuzcoa, Araba, and Navarre, 3 of them in France, Lapurdi, Lower Navarre, and Zuberoa, politically split. Culturally, still one continuous world, connected by language, by tradition, and by a shared sense of being from somewhere different than everyone around them. Now, geography alone doesn't explain a linguistic mystery like this one. We need to be careful here because it's tempting to just say, oh, mountains, isolation, mystery solved. That's too easy, And honestly, it's a little insulting to how complicated real history actually is. But geography does something important. It shapes the conditions under which culture either gets steamrolled or gets a chance to breathe. And the terrain of the Basque Country is, frankly, some of the most defensible, most fragmented, most difficult to conquer landscape in all of Western Europe. Think about the Pyrenees themselves, not just one mountain range, but a maze of ridges, valleys and passes, many of them nearly impassable for large armies, especially before modern roads existed. Then think about the coastline, rugged, cliff, heavy, cut by rivers running down from the highlands into the Bay of Biscay. Add in dense forests, steep river gorges, and a climate that's wetter and greener than most of Iberia, and you get a landscape that doesn't exactly invite easy movement. Armies like flat land. They like clear roads and open plains where cavalry can maneuver and supply lines can stretch without interruption. The Basque terrain offers almost none of that. It offers switchbacks. It offers narrow valleys where a small group defending high ground can hold off a much larger force. It offers 100 tiny pockets of settlement, each one slightly separated from its neighbours by ridgelands and rivers. This is what geographers and historians sometimes call a refugium, a word borrowed from biology, actually. In nature, a refugium is a place where older species survive long after they've gone extinct everywhere else, tucked away in some isolated pocket that the rest of the world sort of forgot about. Deep valleys, isolated islands, mountain plateaus. Places where change moves slower, where the pressures reshaping everything outside just don't reach the same way. Culturally, the same idea applies. A refugium can be a place where older languages, older customs, older ways of organizing society manage to persist, not because they're frozen or primitive, but because the outside pressure to replace them never fully arrived, or arrived so slowly that the culture had time to adapt on its own terms, instead of getting erased overnight. That seems to be part of the Basque story, not the whole story, but part of it. When Celtic-speaking populations moved across much of Iberia, when Rome eventually swept through the peninsula and imposed Latin as the language of administration and trade, when later waves of Visigoths and then various medieval kingdoms tried to consolidate power across the region, the Basque territories kept presenting the same basic problem. They were hard to fully control. Not impossible, Rome did eventually establish a presence there, and we'll get into exactly what that looked like later, but difficult enough that direct administrative pressure was lighter, more sporadic, easier to resist or simply outlast. And here's the thing about small, defensible valleys separated by mountains. They don't just protect against armies. They shape how society organizes itself day to day. When you're living in a valley that's connected to the next valley by a rough mountain path instead of a wide open road, you tend to develop strong local identity. Your town, your valley, your specific patch of land becomes the core unit of life, more so than some distant kingdom or empire that rules on paper but rarely shows up in person. Over centuries, this produced something very distinctive in Basque culture, a dense network of towns and communities, each with its own strong local governance traditions, its own customary laws, its own fiercely maintained sense of identity, all loosely connected to the broader Basque cultural world, but never fully centralized under one single authority for most of history. This shows up later in something called the fueros, traditional local rights and privileges that Basque territories negotiated with whatever larger kingdom technically claimed authority over them, whether that was Castile, Navarre, or eventually Spain itself. These weren't ancient linguistic artifacts. They were medieval and early modern political arrangements. But they reflect something deeper, a pattern of local autonomy that shows up again and again throughout Basque history. Strong towns, strong valleys, strong communal institutions, and a persistent resistance to full absorption into whatever larger political structure was trying to claim the region. So does the terrain explain why Euskara survived when every other pre-Indo-European language in Western Europe eventually vanished. Not by itself, no. Plenty of mountainous, isolated regions across Europe still ended up adopting Latin, or Celtic languages, or later Romance languages, despite difficult terrain. Geography creates conditions. It doesn't guarantee outcomes. What the landscape seems to have done here is buy time and reduce pressure, not eliminate contact entirely. The Basques were never some sealed-off, untouched bubble. They traded, they fought, they intermarried with neighbouring populations for thousands of years, but the intensity and speed of outside cultural pressure appears to have been just different enough, just slower and less totalizing, that the underlying language had room to persist rather than get overwhelmed the way so many other ancient European languages did. This is the environment Euskara had to survive in. Not a fortress, not a time capsule, something more like a slow current instead of a flood, a place where change still happened, but happened at a pace that let something old keep its footing. And that raises the real question we actually came here for. What exactly does this language look like once you get past the geography and start examining the words, the grammar, the structure itself? Because once linguists actually sat down to study Euskara seriously, they found something even stranger than isolation. They found a system that barely resembles anything else on the continent at all. So what actually makes Euskara feel so alien once you start pulling it apart? First, we need to clear up one big term that gets thrown around all the time: language isolate. When linguists call Basque a language isolate, they don't mean this fell out of a UFO, or this has no relatives anywhere in the universe. They mean something more modest, and in a way more unsettling. A language isolate is a language that, as far as we can tell with the tools we have, has no demonstrable genetic relationship to any other known language. Not just different family, not just distant cousin, but if this thing has siblings, they're missing, they're dead, or they're so changed that the family resemblance has vanished. That's where Basque lives. Over more than a century of serious work, people have tried to tie Euskara to Celtic, to Iberian, to Berber, to the Caucasus, to anything that might make it feel a bit less lonely. None of those proposals has convinced most specialists. The regular, systematic sound changes you'd expect from true language relatives, mostly not there. The deep, shared core vocabulary you'd lean on to build a family tree, also not there in a way that survives critical scrutiny. So Euskara is widely treated as an isolate, not because people are lazy or unimaginative, but because the comparisons that would rescue it from that status just don't hold up once you start checking the details. But here's where it gets trickier. Being an isolate doesn't mean Euskara is structurally unique in every way. In fact, some of the things that get hyped as Basque weirdness are, from a global perspective, pretty normal. They just happen to be unusual in Western Europe. Two features get mentioned a lot: ergativity and agglutination. Most of the languages people are used to in Europe, English, Spanish, French, German, are what linguists call nominative accusative. Without going into detail overload, subjects of both I sleep and I see you get treated the same way by the grammar, and objects like you in that second sentence get marked differently, if they get marked at all. Basque doesn't do that. It's largely ergative, absolutive. It groups I sleep with me in you see me as the same kind of thing, and marks the you that's doing the seeing differently. In Basque, the subject of a simple intransitive verb and the object of a transitive verb behave as one team, and the subject of that transitive verb is off on its own. That's ergativity in a nutshell. If that sounds upside down, it's only because Indo-European has trained your brain one way. Ergativity isn't rare globally. You see it in languages from the Caucasus to the Himalayas to Australia. What's odd is finding it in this little corner of Europe surrounded by nominative accusative giants. Then there's agglutination. Instead of using lots of separate helper words, Basque tends to glue pieces together into long information-base words. You take a root and start stacking suffixes that each carry a clear chunk of meaning. This is plural, this is to, this is in, this is of us. You don't get messy internal changes like go becoming went. You get neat, snap-together parts. In that sense, Euskara has more in common with Turkish or Hungarian in its overall flavour than with Spanish or French. Now, this is where a lot of armchair theories go off the rails. They see ergative plus agglutinative and decide, aha, Basque must be related to other ergative, agglutinative languages. Maybe it's secretly kin to Georgian or Sumerian or something in the Caucasus. Same flavour, same family, mystery solved. The problem is typology. The way a language structures its sentences or builds its words is not ancestry. It's style. You can get the same style multiple times in totally unrelated lineages, just like completely unrelated cultures can independently invent pyramids or bow and arrow. The only reliable way to prove genetic relatedness is by showing systematic, law-like sound correspondences and deep, shared basic vocabulary that can't be explained by borrowing or coincidence. Basque just doesn't give us that with any known neighbour. So when we say no known relatives, that's what we mean. We do not mean no relatives at all. Somewhere in deep time, Euskara had sisters, cousins, ancestors like every other language. They're just gone, or they're hiding under so many layers of change that right now we can't reach them. And survival doesn't mean purity. Euskara has been in contact with other languages for millennia, and you can see that right in its vocabulary. Modern Basque is packed with words borrowed from Latin and later from Romance languages. The everyday word for church comes from Latin. So do words for things like window, street, school. More recently you get borrowings from Spanish and French in politics, technology, religion, trade. This is what languages do when they're in long-term contact. They trade words. Sometimes a lot of words, but they tend to guard their core grammar more stubbornly. You can import 1,000 loanwords and still keep your old system of verb agreement, your case endings, your sentence structure. That's what happened in English, which swallowed tons of French and Latin vocabulary, but kept a fundamentally Germanic grammar. It's what happened in Basque on steroids, a deeply non-Indo-European grammatical skeleton, wearing a very European wardrobe of borrowed terms. So we end up with something paradoxical. On the surface, Euskara has been heavily reshaped by its neighbours. Underneath, in the way sentences are built, in the verb system, in the alignment of subjects and objects, it stands apart. The parts of language that change fast under cultural pressure. Vocabulary for tools, institutions, religion show obvious contact. The parts that change slowly across many generations carry the fingerprint of some much older world. And that leads to the unsettling question that hangs over every Basque dictionary and every grammar description. If Euskara is an isolate today, what was it before? What larger linguistic landscape did this language come from, back when Indo-European hadn't yet rolled across Western Europe? If Basque is a survivor, what exactly did it survive from? To answer that, we have to step back in time to a version of Iberia that looked nothing like the Latinized, Romance-speaking peninsula we know now, and try to reconstruct the crowd of peoples and tongues that once surrounded the Basques before Rome ever showed up. When we rewind the map of the Iberian Peninsula to the centuries just before Rome, we don't see Spain and Portugal with neat borders and two big national languages. We see something that looks more like a shattered plate. Dozens of shards, each with its own people, customs, and probably its own language or cluster of languages. Ancient Greek and Roman writers give us a few of the labels those shards wore. Iberians along much of the eastern and southern coasts, Celtiberians in the interior highlands, Lusitanians further west, Turdetani in the south, Cantabrians and Asturians and Vascones in the north, Aquitani just over the Pyrenees on what is now the French side. These names feel solid on the page. They sound like distinct nations. But they're not self-descriptions recorded by the people themselves. They're outsider categories, the view from a ship or from a marching army. Iberian, for example, doesn't refer to everyone on the Iberian Peninsula. In Greek and Roman usage, it usually means the non-Indo-European peoples of the eastern and southeastern coasts, who built cities, minted coins, and used their own writing system. Celtiberian is even messier. It's what Romans called inland groups whose material culture and personal names looked Celtic to them, but who lived in Iberia and had clearly been mixing and merging with local traditions for centuries. Then there are the Aquitani, sitting just north of the Pyrenees, between the Garonne and the mountains. Julius Caesar, who had a habit of classifying people by convenience, divides Gaul into three parts: Belgae, Celtae, and Aquitani. He says explicitly that the Aquitani differ from the Gauls in language, customs, and laws, and align more with the peoples of Iberia. That little throwaway line will become very important later. But we have to be careful. It's tempting to take these ancient ethnonyms and stretch them onto modern maps, to say Celtiberians were the ancestors of X, or this tribe became that nation. Reality was more fluid. Populations shifted, intermarried, split, fused, names expanded or shrank depending on who was doing the naming. Sometimes Iberian meant a specific cultural group. Sometimes it meant those people down there on that coast. Sometimes Celtic meant a language family. Sometimes it meant anyone scary and tribal to the north and west. In other words, ancient labels and modern identities don't line up cleanly. You can't just draw a straight line from Vascons on a Roman map to Basques today and assume continuity in every sense: genes, culture, and language, unbroken and pure. That's not how human history works. What we can say is that pre-Roman Iberia was a contact zone, an Indo-European wave, Celtic-type languages, maybe other related branches, had rolled into the peninsula from the north and centre of Europe. It collided with older populations who were already there, speaking languages that were not Indo-European at all. The result wasn't a clean replacement. It was a patchwork. Along the Mediterranean coast, the Iberian peoples developed an urban, literate culture, trading with Phoenicians and Greeks. In the interior, Celtiberian groups blended Celtic speech and weaponry with local ways of life. In the northwest, Lusitanian and Galician groups show some Celtic features, and some stubbornly non-Celtic ones. In the far north and northeast, the later homelands of the Basques and their neighbours, you get tribes that are poorly described in the texts, sometimes called Celtic, sometimes not, sometimes just lumped together as wild mountain peoples. Basque, under its older ethnonym Vasconic in some theories, is often imagined as a survivor of that pre-Indo-European layer. Not the only one, because there almost certainly were many such languages, but the one that happened to hold on in the Pyrenees and nearby valleys while Indo-European speech spread and hardened around it. This is what linguists mean when they talk about a substrate. When a new language family pushes into a region, the old languages don't vanish overnight. They leave fingerprints, place names that don't fit the new grammar, odd words for local plants, animals and landscape features, maybe even bits of sound pattern or grammar that get absorbed. In Western Europe, a lot of people suspect there was a large, now lost pre-Indo-European substrate. Basque might be the last spoken piece of that vanished puzzle. But we're working in a fog. Our written evidence for pre-Roman Iberia is fragmentary and lopsided. The Iberians along the eastern coast had their own script, influenced by Phoenician and Greek, and we found hundreds of inscriptions. The problem is we don't really understand the Iberian language well. We can sound it out phonetically, but most of the vocabulary is opaque. Celt-Iberian is attested in a few inscriptions, but again, the corpus is small. Lusitanian appears in a handful of Latin letter inscriptions with strange names and words that have sparked a century of debate. For the peoples closest to the historical Basques, the Vasconese, the Aquitani, the mountain tribes of the Western Pyrenees. We mostly have names, personal names, deity names, place names recorded through a Latin filter. Our picture of them comes heavily from Roman and Greek authors who were not neutral observers. They cared about who paid taxes, who rebelled, who made good soldiers. They were not setting out to give us a precise ethno-linguistic atlas. So when we try to place the ancestors of the Basque speakers into this mosaic, we're trying to locate a half-erased tile in a mosaic that's already missing big chunks. We can see that they were not alone. They were part of a crowded, multilingual, multi-ethnic peninsula where Indo-European was only one voice among many. We can infer that people like the Aquitani had languages closer to Basque than to Celtic or Latin. We can suspect that under the Celtic and Latin layers of Iberia, there were older speech communities whose names never even got written down. And this is where the last survivors theme kicks in. If Euskara is a relic of that older layer, then every time you hear it spoken today, you're hearing the echo of a Europe that was mostly erased. Not by a single genocide or a single conquest, but by thousands of small cumulative shifts, trade, intermarriage, military service, prestige, schooling, law. To see how close we can get to that erased world, we have to move north of the Pyrenees for a moment, to those Aquitanians Caesar mentioned, because in their names, scratched in Latin letters on stone, we find the first real historical shadows of something recognisably Basque. When we finally meet something Basque-like in the historical record, it's not in the Basque Country proper. It's north of the mountains, on the Aquitanian side, in what is now southwest France. And it doesn't appear as a long text or a heroic epic. It appears as names, not tribal boasts, not royal decrees, not poetry. Mostly short, formulaic Latin inscriptions, tombstones, dedications to gods, legal markers. The kind of everyday writing that comes when Rome has moved in and started reorganizing everything. Across Rome and Aquitania, especially between the Garonne and the Pyrenees, archaeologists have found dozens of these inscriptions. The Latin is standard, to the gods and shades, to such and such deity, so and so son, of so and so fulfilled this vow. Nothing exotic there. But the names inside those Latin sentences are another story. You get personal names like Niscato, Belexia, Sison, Andere, Sembe. You get deity names like Ilun, Larahe, Hegoi, Arixo, Fagus. You see compound names that look like they were originally two meaningful words glued together, the way Wilhelm in Germanic is will plus helmet. And when specialists who actually know Basque look at these, a lot of them light up like a Christmas tree. Ander as a personal name? In modern Basque, Andere or Andereño means lady, mistress, Sembe or Sembe as an element. Basque has Sem, son. Hegoi as a god. Basque has Hego, south wind. Deity names like Ilun recall Basque Ilun, dark. Lara looks like Basque Lara, pasture. Fagus is the Latin word for beach, but it's sitting in a context where this might be a loan or parallel usage, and Basque is full of beach-related vocabulary because beech forests are central to that landscape. It's not just a handful of coincidences. When you go through the corpus of Aquitanian names, you see patterns of sounds and structures that line up very comfortably with early forms of Euskara. You see name elements repeating in different combinations, the way Bert, Wald, Rick repeat across old Germanic names. This is where onomastics, the study of names, becomes one of the only torches we have in an otherwise dark cave. Names are often conservative. They preserve old words long after they've dropped out of everyday speech. They travel across language borders. They can survive conquest and conversion. Think of how many modern European names have ancient roots. Theodore, from Greek. Patrick, from Latin. Bridget, from an old Celtic goddess. The everyday language around them has changed dramatically, but the name particles keep going. So when we find a region where the personal names and god names are full of elements that look Basque-like in sound, structure and meaning, that's not random noise. It's one of the few solid footholds we get. We can't read the Aquitanian language from these inscriptions the way we can read Latin or Greek. We don't have long sentences in Aquitanian. Almost all the grammar is invisible. No verb endings, no demonstratives, no clear case markers, we can be sure, aren't just Latin. What we have is a box of Lego pieces, name elements that repeat, that combine, that sometimes map neatly to Basque vocabulary and morphology. Linguists use this cautiously. They look at how the sounds line up. Does Aquitanian sembe correspond regularly to Basque semme? Are there consistent patterns like Aquitanian tar matching Basque tar, a suffix for origin or belonging? Do we see similar phonotactics? The same kinds of consonant clusters allowed? The same preference for open syllables? The more of these systematic alignments you can show, the stronger the case becomes that you're not just seeing a few borrowed names or a couple of flukes. You're seeing a close relative of Basque, maybe even an earlier stage of the same language family, spoken north of the Pyrenees in the Roman period. This is why so many specialists are comfortable with a statement that sounds bold, but is actually very modest. Aquitanian, as we glimpse it through these names, is almost certainly a language closely related to the ancestor of modern Basque. But we have to underline as we glimpse it, and closely related. Aquitanian doesn't miraculously solve the big mystery. It doesn't tell us where Basque ultimately came from. It doesn't connect Euskara to any known language family outside this little Pyrenean world. It doesn't prove that there was once a vast Vasconic Europe stretching from the Atlantic to the Danube. What it does do is shrink the fog a bit. Before Aquitanian, the Basque story in written history seems to begin quite abruptly on the south side of the Pyrenees, with Roman mentions of the Vasconnes and their neighbours. Aquitanian shows us that whatever speech community gave rise to Basque was not confined to those later Basque provinces. It had close kin or maybe dialectal siblings across the mountains in Aquitania. That, in turn, strengthens the idea that we're dealing with a regional language family, not just an isolated village tongue that somehow got lucky. It suggests a broader pre-Roman Bascoid zone around the Western Pyrenees, cut later by political frontiers, but once part of a more continuous network of related speech. And because the Aquitanians were clearly distinct from the Celtic-speaking Gauls to their north and east, it gives us one more data point for a pre-Indo-European patch in Western Europe that survived right into the Roman centuries. These people north of the mountains are already not Celtic, not Latin in the eyes of Caesar. Their names whisper words we can still recognise in modern Basque ears. Beyond that, Aquitanian is silent. It doesn't speak of Siberia, or the Caucasus, or North Africa. It doesn't answer the big "where from" originally question. It only says here, in this corner of Roman Gaul, a language very close to early Basque was alive. For our purposes, that's enough to matter. In a story full of hypotheticals and vanished tongues, Aquitanian is the first time we can plant a firm flag on the timeline and say, at this date, in this place, the shadow of Basque is undeniably there. From that foothold we can turn back south into Iberia and watch what happens when Latin itself floods over the mountains and into the valleys where those shadows lingered. By the time Latin really crashes into this story, Rome has already done what Rome does best: turn landscapes into infrastructure. On both sides of the Pyrenees you start seeing the classic Roman toolkit roll out. Military roads tie the region into a wider grid, connecting Pamplona to Zaragoza, Bordeaux to the interior. Way stations, bridges and milestones appear along routes that had once been just footpaths and mule tracks. Fortified camps harden into towns. Towns grow stone theatres, baths, forums, temples. Taxation and courts and censuses arrive. The whole western Pyrenean zone, north and south, gets plugged into an empire that stretches from Britain to Syria. In that framework, Latin isn't just a language, it's the voice of power. It's the language of the governor who can requisition your grain, the soldier who can conscript your nephew, the legal tablet that says who owns which field. It's the medium of contracts, wills, and the elaborate bureaucracy that files humans into categories and columns. If you lived in a Romanized town, say, in one of the civitates of the Vascones, or in the urban centres of Aquitania, Latin was unavoidable. Public inscriptions are in Latin, official announcements are in Latin. If you wanted to move up in the army, in trade, or in administration, you learned Latin and you taught it to your kids. But that doesn't mean you stop speaking what your grandparents spoke. This is where the everyday reality gets more interesting and more slippery. For most of the people in those valleys and uplands, life didn't suddenly become Roman the moment a legion passed by. They still herded flocks to the same pastures. They still navigated the same river crossings, the same mountain passes, the same seasonal cycles. They still married within networks of families that had been entangled for generations. Inside those local networks, the old language, whatever varieties of pre-Romance speech were there, kept doing its job. A farmer could be perfectly capable of muttering the right Latin formula at a tax office, and yet turn around and shout at his kids in something that was not Latin at all. A soldier might write his name in Roman letters, and still swear, flirt and gossip in the speech of home when he met a countryman in the barracks. This kind of bilingualism, Latin for upward and outward, the local language for sideways and inward, was very common across the empire. You see it in Britain with Celtic. You see it in North Africa with Punic and Berber. You see it in the eastern provinces where Greek remains dominant, despite centuries of Roman rule. The Western Pyrenees fit that pattern. Aquitanian-type names in Latin inscriptions are one piece of evidence. Another is the later survival of non-Latin place names and river names in the Basque zone. The Latin cloak settles over the surface, but underneath, a different vocabulary is still being passed along mouth to ear. And as Latin settles in, Euskara doesn't just ignore it, it cannibalizes it. Basque is full of Latin loans. Some are obvious even to non-specialists: aromatar for Roman, Eliza for church, tracing back to Latin ecclesia through a Romance channel. Words for window, street, mile, school, and a whole swarm of Christian vocabulary arrive tied to Latin or to early Romance daughter languages that grew out of it. Look closely and you can see when, in the Roman timeline, many of these words were adopted. Sound changes in the donor language get frozen into Basque like insects in amber. You can tell, for instance, that certain loans came not from the classical Latin you learn in school, but from the evolving spoken Latin that was already turning into Proto-Romance. That means Basque speakers weren't just borrowing from marble inscriptions. They were borrowing from neighbours, traders, and probably from mixed households where one parent had grown up with Latin as a first language. Yet after centuries of contact, Euskara does something very strange by European standards. It takes in the furniture of Latin, hundreds of words, some religious concepts, some administrative terms, but it does not turn into a Romance language. The deep structure stays Basque. Word order, case system, verb morphology, the whole strange agglutinative engine keeps chugging along. Latin nouns get bolted onto Basque grammar. A borrowed word will still sprout Basque suffixes. Take Basque plural markers, obey Basque syntax. This is not how most of Iberia plays it. Across the rest of the peninsula, indigenous languages evaporate or get absorbed into Latin so thoroughly that what's left by the early Middle Ages is a mosaic of Romance dialects, early Castilian, Navarro-Aragonese, Asturo-Leonese, Catalan, Galician Portuguese. The pre-Roman tongues behind them survive only in scraps, a substrate in place names, a handful of loanwords, some phonetic quirks. So why does the Basque area end up different? Why Latin everywhere, Basque still there? There isn't a single magic explanation, and claiming one would mean ignoring how messy language history actually is. Instead, think of overlapping layers of pressure and protection. Geography is the obvious candidate. The Western Pyrenees and their spurs create a knot of rugged terrain, steep valleys, narrow corridors, high pastures that naturally compartmentalize communities. Empires love flat plains. They tolerate mountains. But projecting uniform language and culture across a landscape full of micro-valleys is work. And Rome, efficient as it was, sometimes invested that energy elsewhere. Social structure matters too. If your identity, your property, your obligations, and your alliances are encoded in kinship ties and local customary law, switching into a foreign language wholesale is not trivial. You might learn Latin to deal with outsiders, but the rules that actually govern your life are still debated and transmitted in Euskara. Language shift tends to happen faster where local institutions collapse or are fully replaced, in a place where local structures persist and keep prestige inside the community. The old language has more anchors. Demography plays a part. In some regions, Roman towns attracted large numbers of settlers and veterans from other parts of the empire. The linguistic balance tipped when new Latin-speaking populations outnumbered locals. In the Basque zone, evidence for heavy colonization is weaker. The Latin layer feels thinner, more like an overlay than a demographic replacement. And then there are the accidents of history. Later invasions, political borders, church organization, things we'll get to in the next sections all rework the map Rome left behind. At each stage, Euskara gets tested and yet somehow hangs on. The key point is this: in the Roman period, Basque and its close relatives are already demonstrating a pattern that will define their entire history. They yield in vocabulary, they do not yield in core grammar. They coexist with the imperial language without fully merging into it. Meanwhile, all around them, other local tongues, Celt-Iberian, Lusitanian, Iberian, whatever was spoken in much of Aquitania once you step away from the Bascoid pockets, fade from view. That contrast is what sharpens the central question for everything that follows. When so many of Europe's pre-Indo-European languages drowned quietly in the flood of Latin and later Romance, what combination of geography, politics, culture, and sheer historical luck allowed Basque to keep its head above water? To answer that, we have to follow the story past the collapse of the empire itself, into a new order where Latin stops being the language of emperors and starts becoming the language of bishops and kings. When Rome disintegrates in the West, Latin doesn't vanish. It changes uniforms. Instead of being shouted by imperial officials and carved on stone, it gets chanted by priests and copied by monks. Power isn't gone, it's been reassembled into a different shape. bishops, local warlords, migrating peoples, carving out kingdoms in the ruins. In the Basque orbit, three of those new powers matter a lot: the Visigoths to the south, the Franks to the north, and the slow-forming Basque and Navarrese polities that sit stubbornly in between. Start with the Visigoths. By the 6th and 7th centuries, the Visigothic kingdom rules most of the Iberian peninsula from Toledo. Officially, it's Catholic after a period of Arian Christianity. Its law codes are written in Latin. Its bishops meet in councils where Latin clerical culture is the glue that holds elites together. The kings issue decrees, regulate church property, and try, on parchment at least, to project a uniform legal and religious order. On the map, their sphere stretches up toward what is now La Rioja, Álava, maybe nudging the southern flanks of Basque-speaking territory. But on the ground, control is patchy, especially in mountains. This is a recurring theme. The more vertical the landscape, the fuzzier the king's grasp. For language, the Visigothic period brings two conflicting forces. On one hand, Christianization, missionaries, bishops, and parish priests are vectors of Latin and of the early Romance speech developing out of it. The core religious vocabulary that Basque borrows, words for church, priest, cross, angel, crystallizes around this time and just after. Liturgical texts are in Latin. Preaching may be in some kind of vernacular Romance, depending on the audience and the century, but the whole institutional hierarchy that trains clergy and writes doctrine is committed to Latin literacy. Religion tends to standardize. It uses the same prayers, the same formulas, the same calendar across huge territories. That's a kind of pressure. If your access to salvation, to legitimacy, to marriage and burial rites flows through a Latin literate institution, that institution has leverage over your language behaviour. It can slowly make proper speech sound like the prestige tongues of sermons and charters. On the other hand, the Visigothic state never fully saturates the Basque core. The law that most people actually live by in the uplands remains customary, negotiated within local assemblies and kin groups. You might have a Latin charter stored in some episcopal archive miles away, but the boundary dispute over that pasture is going to be argued in the language all witnesses share. The power of the church seeps in. The power of the crown remains mostly at the edges. Then the map gets shaken again. In the early 8th century, the Umayyad conquest bulldozes the Visigothic regime in most of Iberia. Muslim rule establishes itself in the Ebro Valley and beyond. But in the Pyrenean zone, things fracture. Local aristocracies cut deals, resist, switch sides. Out of that churn, the Kingdom of Asturias rises in the northwest, and in the central Pyrenees and western foothills, a set of marcher lordships and proto-counties begins to form. To the north, the Franks arrive. Under the Merovingians and then Charlemagne, the Frankish kingdom pushes south over the Garonne and into the foothills. They create the Duchy of Gascony and other frontier entities meant to buffer the empire against both Muslim Spain and unruly mountain peoples, Basques very much included. Frankish annals complain regularly about Vascones ambushing armies in narrow passes. These are some of the earliest clear mentions of groups that look a lot like later Basques. Again, two contradictory dynamics hit language. Frankish, and later Capetian power, brings in its own Latin church infrastructure, its own monasteries, its own network of dioceses. Written culture on the northern side of the Pyrenees is very much in Latin, with an emerging Romance vernacular that will one day become Gascon and French. Being part of that political orbit tends to funnel elites into that written culture. But the frontier status of Gascony and the southern slopes also creates space. Marcher zones are messy. Counts and dukes often have to bargain with local communities. You keep supplying warriors and taxes. We don't micromanage your internal customs. That bargain often gets written down as special privileges, exemptions, local rights, recognition of our laws, for a language that can be a shield. If your legal identity is tied to being the people who live by X custom, and that custom is debated in your own tongue, the language inherits some of the prestige of the law. Out of this contested ground rises Navarre. By the 9th and 10th centuries, a kingdom centred on Pamplona Iruña consolidates power over much of what we'd recognise as core Basque territory on the southern side of the mountains. Navarre is culturally layered, Latin Christian in its official documents, entangled with Frankish and later Castilian diplomacy, but with a ruling aristocracy that likely has Basque speech in its background. Here, survival stops looking purely defensive and starts looking active. Navarre's kings and nobles operate in multiple linguistic registers: Latin for charters and dealings with the church, Romance for correspondence with neighbouring courts. But local governance, village assemblies, regional councils, negotiations over pasture rights and road maintenance, probably continues overwhelmingly in Basque across wide swaths of the kingdom. Marriage patterns reinforce this. If noble and free peasant families mostly marry within a Basque-speaking radius, within valleys, neighbouring valleys, a known set of lineages, you get dense internal networks where Basque is the default. Outsiders who marry in are more likely to adapt to Basque than to convert an entire in-law clan to Romance overnight, especially if local prestige is anchored in old lineages who pride themselves on their own ways. By the High Middle Ages, Castile enters the story more forcefully. The expanding Castilian kingdom creeps east into La Rioja and south of Navarre. Later, it will absorb much of what becomes the Basque provinces under its crown. Castile is a powerhouse of written Romance. Its chancery normalizes an early form of Castilian as a language of royal administration. That raises the stakes. Now, for serious upward mobility in Iberian politics, knowing Castilian as well as Latin becomes almost mandatory. Yet Basque-speaking areas negotiate something interesting: fueros. These are bodies of local law and privileges, chartered rights granted by kings to towns, valleys, or provinces. They can cover everything from tax exemptions to obligations for military service to the right to choose local officials. In the Basque and Navarrese world, fueros become a core part of political identity. A fuero doesn't necessarily say, "you may speak Basque." It doesn't have to. By locking in local autonomy over internal affairs, it indirectly shelters the social structures that carry the language: open village councils, local courts staffed by locals, communal land management traditions. When the arguments in those spaces are conducted in Euskara, the law itself becomes a reason to keep using it. Dropping the language would mean unhooking your identity from the very customs that guarantee your special status. So medieval politics cuts both ways. The church and royal administrations spread Latin literacy and later Romance literacy, embedding Basque-speaking elites in a wider cultural world where their mother tongue has little written presence and little external prestige. At any point, a decisive push, more direct administration, heavier colonization, stricter language norms in church life could have tipped things toward shift. But the same patchwork of kingdoms, the same frontier status, the same tradition of negotiated autonomy creates pockets where Basque is not just tolerated, but woven into how power actually functions locally. Community norms that favour endogamy, assemblies that expect debate in the shared local tongue, legal privileges that assume continuity with our ancestors' ways, these are active survival mechanisms. Basque isn't huddling silently in mountain huts while history happens elsewhere. It's sitting in council meetings, settling disputes, arranging marriages, swearing oaths, all under Latin written charters that barely notice the language making them real. The cost of that arrangement is that, on parchment, Euskara is almost invisible. which is exactly what we meet in the next chapter of the story, a language that's everywhere in people's mouths and almost nowhere in the texts they leave behind. If you only trusted parchment, you'd think Basque basically didn't exist until shockingly late. That's not because people weren't speaking it. It's because, for most of history, writing is not a neutral mirror of what people say. It's a tool of power. Think about who writes in the medieval world we've just walked through. It's not shepherds in a Navarrese valley or ironworkers in a Biscayan village. It's clergy, royal scribes, notaries attached to courts and monasteries. People whose salaries, status, and entire professional identity depend on using the correct written codes. Latin first, then the rising prestige romances. If you're a clerk in Pamplona, you do not get points for being linguistically realistic. You get points for producing documents that look like everyone else's across Christendom, neat Latin formulas, inherited legal phrases, a script your colleagues can read in Leon and Toulouse. The job is to efface local messiness, not display it. So you write Petrus Filius Fortunae instead of Peru Fortunjo Samea, even if you've never heard anyone call them anything but the Basque versions in an actual village. From the perspective of a language like Basque, that creates a bizarre optical illusion. Euskara can be absolutely dominant in speech over huge areas, and still barely show up in the historical record, because in those spheres where writing happens, cathedral chapters, royal courts, notarial offices, the default agreement is we pretend we all live in Latin, and later in written Romance. You only break that rule for specific reasons. Sometimes it's necessity. A gloss in the margin of a Latin sermon, explaining a tricky word in the language peasants actually understand. A local place name that simply has no Latin equivalent. A personal nickname that everyone uses no matter what the charter says. Sometimes it's performance. A king or noble wanting to show closeness to his Basque-speaking subjects might preserve a Basque phrase in a document as a kind of signature or curiosity. Not because he respects the language as a literary medium, but because he knows it marks identity. Those tiny breaches in the wall are what historians cling to. They start in dribs and drabs. In late antiquity and the early Middle Ages, we mostly get external labels: Vascones, Wascones, Guasconia, Latin and Frankish authors trying to name troublesome mountain people. Actual Basque words, they creep in later. Place names embedded in Latin charters, toponyms that are clearly not Latin or Romance, with Basque roots you can still pass today. Personal names that look stubbornly non-Latin, familiar Basque elements buried in otherwise standard formulas. By the early second millennium, we begin to see what linguists call glosses, single Basque words or short phrases written next to Latin or Romance texts. A priest jotting down the Basque version of a term in the margin. A bilingual note clarifying some local reality. These are not flowing narratives. They're fragments, breath marks caught in the machinery of the official languages. Later still come the first continuous Basque sentences, religious poems, catechisms and sermons. By the 16th century, we finally get full texts, most famously Bernard Hector Perez' Linguae Vasconum Primitiae in 1545, the first printed book in Basque. By then, Euskara has been spoken for millennia. On paper, it's a newcomer. So when people say Basque appears late in writing, that doesn't mean the language itself is young. It means the power structures that controlled pens had no reason to use it until very specific conditions made it useful or symbolically valuable. Literacy systems are like floodlights. They illuminate whatever the powerful care about: legal ownership, royal decrees, orthodox doctrine, elite correspondence. If peasants' daily conversations don't matter to those goals, those conversations remain in the dark. 1,000 farmers can speak Basque every day and leave almost no written trace. One bishop switches from Latin to Romance for a sermon collection, and suddenly the history books announce, "Here is the birth of a new language." That asymmetry has consequences. For Basque, the silence on parchment leaves giant gaps into which people pour whatever they want. Romantic nationalists in the 19th century fill it with tales of an unbroken primordial tongue, unchanged since the dawn of time. Amateur decipherers insist that every undeciphered script from Iberia to the Caucasus is obviously Basque in disguise. Others go the opposite way and treat the lack of early texts as evidence that Basque must be a late, marginal arrival. The evidence does not justify any of those extremes. It just tells us that for most of its history, Euskara lived where scribes rarely pointed their pens. But the silence isn't total. Those early glosses, those stubborn place names, those personal names, half Latinized and half Basque, plus the way the language looks today, they're all crumbs on the trail. And there's another source of evidence, one that doesn't depend on medieval clerks at all, Basque itself, its internal diversity, its dialects, the layer cake of old and new words inside it. Those are like tree rings and fault lines, recording a history that never made it into charters. To get at that story, we have to stop staring at what's missing from parchment and start listening closely to the differences inside the language that survived. When linguists look at Basque today, they don't see one uniform thing. They see a fractured landscape. Euskara in the far west around Biscay does not sound like Euskara on the French side of the border, and both sound different from the Basque of inland Navarre or the mountainous valleys of Sol and Roncal. Even before modern standardization, speakers knew it. You cross a few ridges, and suddenly the pronouns, the verb endings, even common words start to shift. Over time, scholars have drawn lines through this chaos. You'll often see 6 or 7 major dialect groups listed: Western or Biscayan, Guipuzcoan, Upper Navarrese, Lower Navarrese, Lapurdian on the coast, Sulatin, and the now extinct Roncalese. Different maps draw the boundaries differently, but the takeaway is the same. For a supposedly small language, Basque packs a lot of internal variety into a compact space. That variety is not random noise, it's a fossil record of separation and contact. If you find a valley where people all share some quirky sound change, say they consistently turn an old N into an R in certain positions, and that quirk never jumps over a particular mountain pass, that's geography writing itself into the language. Those people have been talking mostly to each other, not to the folks over the ridge for a long time. On the other hand, if a strange new verb form spreads along a medieval trade road and shows up in port towns but not in isolated highland villages, that's contact. That tells you where people were moving, trading, marrying, gossiping. Basque dialects are full of patterns like this. Western dialects have innovations in the verb system that the Eastern ones never adopted. Solatin in the northeast is off doing its own thing with vowels and consonants, almost like a linguistic island. Roncalese, before it died out in the 20th century, preserved archaisms, older features that had vanished elsewhere, like a time capsule stuck in a high valley. Put all of that together and you get a picture. Basque has been spoken across this region long enough for deep, structured dialects to form, for some to drift apart, for others to innovate together, and for at least one to go extinct. That's not the footprint of a language that just showed up in the Middle Ages. But dialect maps are only the surface. Underneath them is something more subtle, shared innovations. Linguists are not just counting how many words differ from village to village. They're looking for changes that are unlikely to have happened twice by accident. If 2 dialects share some weird new grammatical twist, or a counterintuitive sound shift, chances are they inherited it from a period when they formed a single community, after they had already split from their cousins. Imagine you and your sibling invent a family in-joke as teenagers. Your cousins don't know it. 30 years later, you can barely remember your childhood. But the in-joke still pops up in your speech. That in-joke is a shared innovation. For Basque, these in-jokes are things like particular auxiliary verb forms, ways of forming past tenses, or specific patterns of sound erosion. By tracing who shares which innovations, linguists can sketch a family tree of dialects, and then working backwards, reconstruct some features of the parent language before the dialects diverged. They call that older, undocumented stage Proto-Basque. It's not a single moment in time, more like a moving target, a set of features we can be reasonably sure existed before certain splits. From that reconstructed stage, you can see a few big sound changes marching forward through the centuries, leaving their fingerprints on every word they touch. And then there are the ghosts under the ground, place names. Toponymy, the study of place names, is one of the most powerful tools we have for peering into linguistic deep time, especially when early texts are scarce. Look at a Basque map and you see elements repeat. Ondo for by, near, uri or iri, possibly connected to town, aga, eta. Names like Guernica, Ujarte, Iruñea, Donostia. Even in places where Basque has not been spoken for centuries, you still get stubborn islands of clearly Basque-looking toponyms. Those names often predate the current language situation. A Roman or a medieval scribe might record a village name they do not understand, simply approximating the sounds. Centuries later, the spoken Basque in that area might have shifted or been replaced by Romance. But the old name clings on, slightly misspelled, like a pressed leaf in a legal archive. Careful comparison between modern Basque and these old toponyms lets linguists see older layers of the language that no one ever wrote down as sentences, an element that shows up in 9th century charters across a wide area, matching a known Basque root, suggests that some form of Basque was already there when those documents were drawn up. A pattern confined to a small cluster of valleys hints at an older micro-dialect that may have vanished in speech but survives in the map. This is where deep time in language really kicks in. We can watch sound changes happening over 1,000 or 2,000 years by comparing old forms and new ones. We can say by the time this charter was written, this sound shift had already happened in this area, but not that one. We can see that Proto-Basque must be older than Latin's arrival, because it already loaned words into early Latinized toponyms. What we cannot do is slam a precise date on the birth certificate. Language does not start on Tuesdays. There is no year zero of Basque. At best, we can say that certain changes must have happened before X, because they're already reflected in Roman inscriptions, or after Y, because a medieval writer still records pre-change forms. Beyond that, we're in the fog of deep time, working with relative sequences, not exact years. And we hit another limit, internal reconstruction versus external comparison. Internal reconstruction is like doing archaeology with one site. You dig down through the layers of one language, its dialects, its old forms, its irregular verbs, and infer what must have been true earlier. That's how we get a lot of Proto-Basque. External comparison is different. That's when you line up several related languages and see how they systematically match and differ, like we do with Latin, Spanish, French and Italian, or with Sanskrit, Greek and German. From that kind of comparison you can build a much deeper, more robust history. With Basque, that second tool is limited. We do not have a confirmed sister language to compare it to. So internal evidence and toponymy do the heavy lifting, but they can only take us so far. They let us see that Basque has a long, complicated, layered history in its current homeland. They show waves of change, pockets of conservatism, old roots under newer cultural overlays. What they can't tell us on their own is where Basque sits in the bigger human language family tree. For that, we have to look outward to its Indo-European neighbours, to contact phenomena, to proposals about a deeper pre-Indo-European substrate, and figure out what's genuine relationship and what's just long cohabitation on the same patch of earth. When you start looking outward from Basque, the first thing you have to learn is a kind of intellectual discipline, how to separate family from neighbourhood. In historical linguistics, that's the difference between genetic relationship and borrowing. A genetic relationship means two languages are descended from a common ancestor. Spanish and Italian both come from Latin. English and German both come from Proto-Germanic. You can see this in rows and rows of basic words lining up with regular sound correspondences. Pater, padre, pair, father, tress, dry, three. It's not just a few shared terms, it's the skeleton of the vocabulary and the grammar moving in lockstep. Borrowing is different. That's what happens when languages bump into each other in real life. Trade, conquest, religion, fashion, words jump ship all the time. English has thousands of French loans, but it is not a Romance language. Japanese has a ton of English vocabulary, but it is not genetically related to English. Borrowing paints the surface. Genetic relationship shapes the bones. Basque lives in a part of Europe where that surface has been repainted again and again. If you strip Euskara down, what you find is layers of vocabulary like archaeological strata. At the bottom, native words whose origins we don't know. On top of that, a very old Latin layer, terms that entered the language during the Roman Empire and its immediate aftermath. Above that, waves of borrowing from the surrounding Romance languages. Navarrese Romance, Gascon, Spanish, French, each with its own accent, its own time stamp. Take religion and administration, words connected to Christianity, Roman law, urban life. A huge number of them in Basque are ultimately Latin. Eliza for church goes back to ecclesia, Angeru for angle, Lege for law, Erige for king, Bake for peace, Gusti for all, probably from Gustus. Some were taken straight from Latin, others came via early Romance and got reshaped on the way in. Then there are practical terms, words for money, measures, new crops, technologies, many are Romance loans. Diru, money, may be from Latin denarius. Auci, chair, from a Latin or Romance form related to Altilia or similar. Even the Basque word for God, Janko, sits in a semantic field that was thoroughly Romanized and Christianized. The important point is not to memorize the etymologies. It's what this layering tells us. First, it shows that Basque speakers were not isolated mountain hermits. They were plugged into Roman and then medieval networks deeply enough that core domains of life, religion, law, prestige technology, came with Latin and Romance labels. Second, it gives you a relative timeline. Oldest loans tend to be those that underwent the deepest sound changes to fit Basque phonology. Later ones sound more recognizably Spanish or French. You can hear history in the accent of the borrowed word. But loanwords don't just arrive as naked items on a list. Long contact can also reshape how a language sounds and how it builds sentences. That's called areal influence. Look at the phonology. Basque has sounds like R and clusters like pli, luct, cray, kr in loans, patterns that fit comfortably in a Romance neighbourhood. It has a contrast between simple and trilled Rs that you also find in Spanish. In some dialects you see sibilant systems and stress patterns that look like they've rubbed shoulders with neighbouring languages for centuries. Syntax too shows signs of contact. Basque is fundamentally an SOV language, subject, object, verb at the end, and it has an ergative alignment system that marks subjects of transitive verbs differently from subjects of intransitive verbs. That's not Romance. That's not Indo-European at all. But in modern speech, especially near cities and in bilingual communities, you start to see Romance-style patterns, more SVO order, some analytic paraphrases that mirror Spanish, calques where idioms are translated piece by piece. This is what happens when populations are bilingual for a long time. Structures bleed across the boundary, at least in colloquial speech. Here's the trap. If you only look at the surface, shared words, similar rhythms, you can talk yourself into seeing a family relationship where there isn't one. People have tried. Over the centuries, Basque has been claimed as a cousin of everything from Celtic to Iberian Latin to obscure branches of Indo-European. The argument usually goes like this. Look, this Basque word kind of sounds like this Latin or Celtic word, and they mean something vaguely similar. Therefore, Basque must be Indo-European. But real genetic comparison doesn't run on kind of sounds like. It runs on systematic correspondences in basic vocabulary and core grammar. Kinship terms, body parts, low numbers, pronouns, basic verbs like to be, to go, to eat. Those are the words that resist borrowing the longest. Those are the ones that carry the family signal. In Basque, that signal does not match Latin or Celtic or Germanic or any other known Indo-European branch. The word for one is bat, not unto is by, 3 is hiru, 4 is lau. Head is buru, foot is oin, water is ora, eye is ni, you is zu, we is gu. These don't line up with ego to nos. The sound correspondences don't fall into any Indo-European pattern. The grammar, the ergativity, the complex system of suffixes on nouns and verbs, the way agreement works, sits in a different design space entirely. What you see instead is a language that has been living in an Indo-European neighbourhood for 2,000 years and has dressed accordingly in places, Latin clothes in the church and the courthouse, Romance accents around the edges of pronunciation, a few borrowed sentence habits in casual speech. Underneath, the skeleton is something else. That's the real shock once you strip away the contact phenomena. After all this time, Roman rule, Visigothic kingdoms, Frankish pressure, Castilian expansion, French administration, Euskara is still not an Indo-European language. It has taken on thousands of Indo-European words, it has bent and shifted under their weight, but its core structure, its oldest vocabulary, its deepest grammar remain alien to the family that swallowed almost all of Europe. All the noise of contact can make Basque look more familiar than it really is. Once you control for that, the mystery doesn't shrink. It sharpens. If anything, heavy contact makes the question louder. If Basque could survive this much Indo-European influence without becoming Indo-European, then what exactly is it? And how far back does the story go before Latin, before Celtic, before any Indo-European language ever reached the western edge of Europe? To answer that, linguists zoom out and ask a much bigger question. What did Europe sound like before Indo-European? Not just Iberia. The whole continent, the rivers, the coasts, the forest belts from the Atlantic to the Urals. Because Indo-European doesn't look like something that slowly fermented in every corner of Europe at once. It looks like something that arrived, expanded and layered itself on top of whatever was already there. This is where the word substrate comes in. In linguistics, a substrate is the ghost of an older language that used to be spoken in a place before a new language took over. The old language disappears as a living tongue, but it leaves traces, loan words that don't fit the new language's inherited vocabulary, place names that refuse to be explained, weird quirks of sound or grammar that don't match the family tree. Think of it like building a new city over ancient ruins. You pave the streets, you put up glass towers, but under your feet, the foundations, the street grid, even some of the building footprints are older than your civilization. Most people walking around have no idea. An archaeologist with a shovel can tell, With Indo-European in Europe, the basic model most historical linguists work with goes like this: some form of Proto-Indo-European, probably spoken somewhere in the Pontic-Caspian steppe, begins expanding west and south several thousand years BCE. Different branches peel off: Celtic, Italic, Germanic, Balto-Slavic, Greek, later Romance built on Latin, later Slavic expansions, later Germanic expansions. Waves following waves. This doesn't mean the entire continent was empty soundscape before that. It means that whatever languages were spoken in Europe before those expansions, call them pre-Indo-European, got pushed back, swallowed, or replaced almost everywhere. What survives today in terms of fully living languages is essentially one thing: Basque. So one huge hypothesis is this: maybe Basque is not a bizarre one-off. Maybe it is the last visible shard of a much larger family of pre-Indo-European languages that once covered big chunks of Western Europe. Under that view, Aquitanian, the language we glimpse in Roman-era inscriptions north of the Pyrenees, isn't just Basque-like. It is another branch of the same old family. Iberian, the language written on those still only partly understood inscriptions along the Mediterranean coast, might be a more distant cousin. Maybe there were related tongues in southern France, in the Alps, in pockets that vanished with no writing at all. Picture a map of Europe around, say, 4000 BCE. In this scenario, you'd have Indo-European dialects pushing in from the east and southeast. But the Atlantic facade from Portugal through the Bay of Biscay and up into parts of Gaul could be speaking a cluster of related languages. Basque would be the last one standing. It's an elegant story. It fits the intuition that a language this odd, this resistant to Indo-European, must have had friends once. But to move from could be to is, historical linguistics needs more than a good story. To prove that Basque belonged to a wider ancient family, you would need data from that family. Not just a handful of names. Real running text, or at least longer lists of clearly understandable words from other, independently documented languages. Then you'd need to line them up the way Indo-Europeanists do. You'd look for consistent sound correspondences in basic vocabulary, the kind of core words that don't usually get borrowed: body parts, kinship terms, low numerals, basic verbs. If Basque buru for head lined up with some other language's pulu, and bat bi hiru lined up with another language's pat pi kiru, and that pattern repeated across dozens of items, you could start reconstructing a common ancestor. You'd want the grammar to cooperate too. Maybe not identical, but with shared structural quirks that are hard to acquire from neighbours, shared ergative patterns, similar ways of marking cases, parallel systems of verb agreement. The sort of deep design that you don't just pick up on a trade route. So far, we don't have that. Aquitanian is clearly close to Basque, close enough that many scholars simply treat it as an ancient Basque dialect cluster. Iberian, Tartessian, other fragmentary languages of the peninsula. The inscriptions exist, but they are short, often formulaic, and the meanings are uncertain. This is not a buffet of clean vocabulary items. It's a handful of partially labelled puzzle pieces. Some researchers see tantalising resemblances. A word here that might match a Basque root, a pattern there that might suggest similar morphology. Others argue that with small, poorly understood corpora, coincidences are inevitable, and that you can find parallels to almost anything if you're allowed enough wiggle room. That's why you get competing interpretations. One camp leans toward a Basque family view, Euskara as one surviving branch of a larger Western European phylum, now almost entirely erased. Another camp sees Basque as a local holdout with no demonstrable external relatives, surrounded by a mosaic of other unrelated pre-Indo-European languages that all died off. And over all of this hangs the problem of absence. Indo-European languages come with long written traditions, big corpora, and clear internal structure. Pre-Indo-European Europe, by contrast, is mostly silent. No epic poems, no grammars, very few inscriptions, many of them undeciphered or only partly understood. We have a continent-sized question mark and a handful of scattered clues. This is where the erased Europe idea gets larger than Basque. If Indo-European is the layer we can see and map in detail, there was almost certainly a whole earlier linguistic landscape beneath it. Dozens, maybe hundreds of languages, some related, some not, shaping how people named rivers, mountains, plants, tools, gods. Most of them left only place names and faint substrate fingerprints in the Indo-European dialects that replaced them. Basque is different because it isn't just a fingerprint. It's a living language, still carrying whatever it remembers from that older world. Whether it was once part of a big pre-Indo-European family or a small isolated cluster, it is our most direct line of contact with that lost layer. And that's why the next step in the story isn't just about Euskara itself, but about other languages on the peninsula that tease us with written traces, half-decoded scripts, and the possibility, just the possibility, of long-lost cousins. If you want to go hunting for those cousins, Iberia looks like the perfect place to start. Because unlike most of pre-Indo-European Europe, the Iberian Peninsula did something extraordinary. It wrote, not in Latin, not in Greek, but in its own indigenous scripts, Iberian along the eastern and southeastern coasts, Tartessian and related southwestern inscriptions further west, plus a couple of other local systems that blink into view and then vanish again. On stone slabs, on bronze plaques, on pottery. These people carved lines of text in languages that were already old when the Romans were still a rumour. Dozens of inscriptions, then hundreds, now well over 2,000 for Iberian alone. If Basque is a living relic of an erased landscape, those scripts are like fossil leaves pressed into the rock nearby. You can't not look at them. So what do we actually have? Take Iberian first. Iberian here doesn't mean anything in Iberia. It refers to a specific non-Indo-European language written from around the 5th to the 1st centuries BCE along the Mediterranean side of the peninsula. The writing system itself is, in a sense, solved. Scholars can read a lot of it aloud. They know what many of the signs stand for in terms of sounds. It's a semisyllabary. Some signs represent syllables like ta, te, tai, others single consonants or vowels. Through careful comparison, looking at bilingual coin legends with Greek or Latin, spotting repeated personal names, tracing patterns across hundreds of inscriptions, epigraphers have worked out a pretty reliable phonetic value for most of the characters. So you can look at an Iberian inscription and say, with considerable confidence, this probably reads something like Seltar Bastia Ekiar. The problem is that doesn't mean you understand what it says. Being able to transcribe the sounds of a language is not the same thing as deciphering the language itself. Egyptian hieroglyphs were visually read long before Champollion used the Rosetta Stone to crack their grammar and vocabulary. Mayan glyphs were copied for centuries before researchers could tell you they were talking about wars, kings, and dates. With Iberian, we are mostly stuck at the sound stage. We can segment names. We can recognize that certain endings probably mark something like son of or dedicated by. We can guess that particular sign clusters might be place names or deities. But full sentences, clear line-by-line translations, not yet. Tartessian and the so-called southwestern script are even murkier. These inscriptions, mostly from southwestern Iberia and dating earlier, roughly the late 2nd to early 1st millennium BCE, use a related but distinct writing system. Epigraphers again can assign plausible sound values to many signs, especially where there are overlaps with Iberian. They can spot recurring patterns, maybe personal names, maybe formulaic phrases. But the underlying language? Still debated. Is it one language or several? Indo-European or not, related to Iberian, or something else entirely? The corpus is small, the inscriptions are short, and the context are frustratingly ritual or funerary. Exactly the sort of conservative, repetitive language that gives you fewer clues about everyday vocabulary. Into this fog walks a very human urge to connect the unknown to the one thing nearby that we do know a bit about. So a number of researchers, especially in the 20th century, proposed that Iberian might be related to Basque, or that Tartessian might preserve very old relatives of Basque roots, or that if you squint at the right sequence of signs, you can see Basque words hiding in plain sight. Sometimes this is done cautiously, with lots of question marks and maybes. Sometimes it's done with more enthusiasm than caution. On paper, the appeal is obvious. Here you have a non-Indo-European language that survives in the Western Pyrenees. Just to the south and east, you have non-Indo-European inscriptions in a mysterious language. If you're hoping for a pre-Indo-European family, this looks like the moment the family photo might actually include more than one person. The trouble is how easy it is to fool yourself when the data are thin. Language is finite. There are only so many short sound combinations humans are comfortable producing. If you take a few hundred Iberian word-shaped sequences, whose meanings you don't really know, and you take a few thousand Basque roots, and you give yourself freedom to adjust sounds and meanings a bit, you will find matches. It would be statistically surprising if you didn't. Bele here looks like Basque bela there. This ending reminds you of that Basque case suffix. That cluster kind of resembles a Basque word for city or stone or water, and once you notice a match, your brain starts looking for more matches along the same lines. Pattern matching is one of the human brain's greatest strengths. It is also one of its biggest traps. Historical linguistics is basically pattern matching under very strict rules. To claim a genetic relationship between two languages, you need more than a handful of look-alike words. You need systematic correspondences, which means when sound X in Basque lines up with sound Y in Iberian, it should do so not just once but across dozens of independent items. If Basque B regularly corresponds to some Iberian P or B in core vocabulary, that pattern should be consistent. If a final A in Basque nouns maps to a particular ending in Iberian, you should be able to show that again and again, including in words that are not obvious candidates for borrowing. You also want to control the meanings. It's not enough that a Basque word for stone looks like an Iberian sequence you arbitrarily decide must also mean stone. You need independent reasons to think the Iberian word has that meaning, either from context or from internal analysis. So far, when you apply those stricter tests, the Basque-Iberian and Basque-Tartessian connections get shaky. You can still find intriguing individual parallels, and some scholars continue to defend distant relationships. But there is no widely accepted set of regular sound correspondences linking Iberian or Tartessian to Basque, the way, say, Latin and Sanskrit can be linked within Indo-European. There is no shared core vocabulary that everyone agrees on, with meanings grounded in context rather than wishful thinking. The grammar, insofar as we can glimpse it, doesn't line up cleanly either. That doesn't mean there is definitely no relationship. It means that with the inscriptions and understanding we currently have, we can't demonstrate one in a way that satisfies the methodological bar linguists have set from other well-worked language families. And this is where the story stays interesting rather than disappointing, because the situation isn't static. Every few years, archaeologists dig up a new inscription. a longer Iberian text on a new kind of object, a Tartessian stone with unusual features. Digital imaging reveals faint lines that were missed before. Statistical methods refine how we segment and analyze signs. A bilingual text, say, an Iberian dedication paired with a clear Latin translation, could, in theory, appear tomorrow and change everything. If that happened, we might suddenly know the meanings of a dozen Iberian words with confidence. That would let us test old Basque connections under much better conditions. Some would almost certainly evaporate as coincidences. Others might survive and strengthen. Entire patterns might snap into focus that nobody had seen before. Or we might discover that Iberian and Tartessian are their own branches of the lost European thicket, neighbours to whatever Basque descended from, maybe trading words and structures over millennia, but not siblings on the family tree. Either way, Basque would no longer be alone in that deep pre-Indo-European darkness. It would have at least a few named companions, languages we could point to and say, these too were part of the old chorus that Indo-European mostly silenced. For now, though, those scripts sit in a frustrating in-between state. Not unreadable, not fully readable, surrounded by tempting resemblances that vanish as often as they hold up. And into that vacuum something else seeps in, myths, romantic theories, identity projects that happily ignore the hard limits of the evidence. That's where we have to be even more careful, because once a mystery becomes symbolic, people start wanting answers for reasons that have nothing to do with how languages actually work. Once a mystery becomes symbolic, it stops being just a puzzle and starts being a mirror. People look into it and see what they want to see. Basque is a perfect example of that. On one side you get the grand cosmic origin stories. Basques as survivors of Atlantis, Basques as the lost tribe of Israel, Basques as refugees from some vanished Ice Age super-civilization, Basque as the language Adam and Eve spoke before Babel scrambled everything. None of these come from linguistics, or archaeology, or genetics. They come from a very old human habit. If something is ancient and hard to explain, put it at the centre of every story. On the other side, you get something more modern, but just as distorting, identity projects. Romantic nationalists in the 19th and 20th centuries loved the idea of a people outside of history, untouched, pure, original. If you're trying to build a distinctive nation, a language like Basque looks like a gift from the gods. So Basque sometimes got recast as a kind of fossil of European humanity. Basques as the first Europeans, unchanged since the Stone Age. Basque as the one true tongue of the continent, everything else an invasive newcomer. Maps were redrawn with thick ancient Basque empires stretching across half of Europe. Dictionaries were written proving that Sumerian, Egyptian, Etruscan, you name it, were secretly Basque in disguise. At the same time, outsiders got fascinated by this mysterious race in the Pyrenees. Early anthropologists went measuring skulls and noses, looking for primitive or archaic traits. They linked language to blood in ways that now read as uncomfortably close to racial theory. None of that helped anyone understand Euskara. It did a lot to entangle it with ideas about who counts as really Basque and who doesn't. The core problem in all these stories is the same. They grab one piece of reality. Basque is unusual, Basque really is old, Basque really did persist, where other languages disappeared, and then inflate it until it becomes myth. Here's where it helps to separate a few things very clearly. First, language, culture, and genes are related, but they're not the same. You can switch languages in a generation. You can marry into a community and learn its customs. Your DNA, your grandparents, your schooling, your political views, your vocabulary, these do not always travel together. The Basque Country today is genetically distinctive in some ways. Yes. That's interesting, and we'll get to the DNA in a later section. But that does not mean Basque speakers are a sealed Stone Age population in modern dress. The region has seen Romans, Visigoths, Franks, Muslims, pilgrims, mercenaries, merchants, factory workers. People moved in, people moved out, people intermarried. The cultural continuity is real, the biological purity narrative is not. Second, being old is not the same as being unchanged. Cultures that survive do so by adapting. Euskara today is full of words borrowed from Latin, Romance, French, Spanish, Gascon. Its grammar has shifted over time. New dialects emerged, others blurred into each other, some probably vanished without ever being written down. The Basque-speaking communities of the Bronze Age would not recognize a modern Basque news broadcast as their language without effort. You can absolutely be the descendant of very old populations and still be a product of thousands of years of contact, change, and negotiation. In fact, that's the only way to still be here. Third, uncertainty is not a blank check. Not knowing where Euskara came from does not mean it came from anywhere you like. No clear relatives does not mean same as Sumerian if you're creative enough. Pre-Indo-European does not mean first language of humankind. Historical linguistics is frustrating in this way. When the comparative method fails to show a relationship, the honest answer is often, we don't know, not therefore Atlantis. But we don't know is also a space where harmful ideas can grow. Claims about pure blood, original races, or unchanged peoples have been used all over Europe to exclude, to rank, to justify violence. Basques have been on the receiving end of some of that and, like every group, are not immune to reproducing softer versions of it internally. So how do you talk about a language like Euskara, with pride, with a sense of its uniqueness, without sliding into fantasy or purity talk? You shift the focus. Instead of we are descended unchanged from the first Europeans, you can say our communities have kept a non-Indo-European language alive in a part of Europe where almost everything else shifted. That is an extraordinary historical achievement. Instead of our genes prove we are different, you can say this region shows traces of deep population continuity layered with later arrivals. That's true of almost every place on Earth. What's special here is that the language never fully gave way. Instead of Basque is the mother of all languages, you can say, Basque reminds us that Europe once sounded very different and that most of that soundscape is gone. Euskara's survival makes that loss visible. You don't have to make Basque supernatural to make it matter. In fact, grounding it in what we can actually show, long-term regional continuity, intense contact with neighbours, massive resilience under pressure, makes it more impressive, not less. It turns Euskara from a mystical relic into what it really is, a human language that has survived against long odds because real people chose again and again to pass it on. So we keep the mystery. We admit the gaps. We resist the urge to fill them with stories that flatter us or confirm what we already believe. And then we ask a different kind of question. If Basque isn't a fossil from Atlantis, and it isn't proof of some untouched race, but it does reach back into a very old European layer, what can other kinds of evidence tell us about that deep past? That's where genetics comes in, not as a stamp of purity or a weapon in identity politics, but as another, very limited, very specific line of evidence we can put next to the language and the archaeology and see what patterns emerge. When geneticists first started sampling Basque populations in the late 20th century, the pattern looked unusual. If you plot people on a kind of genetic map of Europe, most populations form gentle gradients. Southern French blend into northern Spaniards, who blend into Portuguese, Italians, and so on. Neighbours look a lot like neighbours, with smooth transitions rather than sharp boundaries. Basque populations, especially in more historically rural valleys, tended to sit a little off that smooth curve. Not on another planet, not some alien cluster, but consistently shifted. A bit more ancient European farmer ancestry, slightly less of some later incoming components that are strong elsewhere in Iberia and France. Patterns in blood groups and later in genome-wide studies that suggested a degree of long-term regional continuity. Then ancient DNA arrived and blew the doors open on all of Europe. Suddenly, we weren't just comparing modern populations to each other. We were comparing them to people who had actually lived in the Neolithic, the Bronze Age, the Iron Age. Farmers buried under dolmens, steppe pastoralists from the Pontic Caspian region, hunter-gatherers from Mesolithic forests. Across much of Europe, the story turned out to be one of massive mixture. Local hunter-gatherers getting largely replaced or absorbed by incoming farmers from Anatolia. Then, a few thousand years later, another big wave, people with steppe ancestry linked to cultures like Yamnaya sweeping in, bringing new genes, new social structures, probably new languages. In Iberia, that steppe-related influx hits hard around the Bronze Age. Ancient skeletons show a dramatic replacement of Y chromosome lineages, strong evidence for male-biased migration. By the Iron Age, many communities on the peninsula look genetically like a blend of earlier farmers, local hunter-gatherer remnants, and these steppe-derived groups. Basque Country samples fit into this picture, but with a twist. Ancient DNA from the region suggests that Basque area populations also absorbed steppe ancestry, but they seem to have kept a higher proportion of older Neolithic farmer and local hunter-gatherer components compared to some neighbouring regions. Over time, especially in more isolated valleys, they show signs of relative continuity, fewer later changes, less turnover in certain lineages. Modern Basque populations, when compared to these ancient genomes, line up as the descendants of these Bronze and Iron Age mixes, with some continuity and some drift, but no miraculous untouched Stone Age bubble. Just a region where the genetic story smoothed out earlier and stayed relatively stable. So is that why they still speak Basque? Here's where we have to be very careful. Genes do not carry verbs, case endings, or word order. There is no Basque gene hiding in the chromosomes. Language can leap from one genetic background to another in a couple of generations. A village can shift from one language to another because of prestige, trade, schooling, religion, marriage patterns, or conquest, while the majority of ancestors stay exactly the same. We have plenty of examples. Most people in Latin America today are genetically much more indigenous and African than they are Iberian, but the dominant languages are Spanish and Portuguese. Hungarians speak a Uralic language in a genetic landscape that looks broadly Central European. English spread over half the world with very uneven genetic replacement. You can have language shift without mass migration. You can have mass migration without language shift. Sometimes they go together, sometimes they don't. That's the whole problem with trying to use DNA as a shortcut to linguistic history. What ancient DNA has done in Europe is not to solve language puzzles, but to redraw the background map they're sitting on. We now know that old Europe was never a static, homogeneous population, quietly speaking one thing for 10,000 years. It was waves of farmers blending with foragers, herders moving in from the steppe, local groups adopting, resisting, and reshaping what arrived. Multiple pulses of movement and mixture layered on top of each other. In that context, Basque-speaking areas look like places where certain ancient ancestries persisted more strongly, and where later homogenizing trends, Romanization, medieval state building, big-scale population movements were a bit weaker or more selective. That's important context. It makes the persistence of a non-Indo-European language here feel less like a total anomaly and more like one endpoint of a broader range of outcomes. In some regions, steppe-derived elites brought Indo-European languages that spread and stuck. In a few pockets, those languages never quite finished the job. But genetics can't tell us what was being spoken in the Neolithic. It can't tell us whether the early farmers in what is now the Basque Country spoke a language remotely related to modern Euskara, or something entirely different that left no descendants. It can't tell us if the Bronze Age people who fused with steppe migrants already had a non-Indo-European language that then resisted replacement, or if we're looking at multiple language shifts layered on top of the same DNA. At best, DNA can tell us, here, people are more closely related to these ancient groups. Here, there's a noticeable population turnover. Here, things stayed surprisingly stable. That might make it more or less plausible that a language could have persisted. It can sometimes rule out extreme claims. No, this group is not mostly descended from some far-off population that left no trace in the bones. But it can't classify a language, can't assign it cousins, can't rewind sound changes the way historical linguistics can. The most honest position right now is Basque-speaking populations show signs of deep regional roots, mixed with the same big prehistoric migrations that shaped the rest of Western Europe. That fits nicely with the idea of long-term cultural continuity in the area. It does not prove that Euskara is a direct survival of any specific Neolithic or Paleolithic tongue. It does not tell us what its relatives were, or if any of them survived long enough to be written down. To go further than that, we have to bring the genetics into conversation with everything else: archaeology, place names, loanwords, historical records, and the internal evidence of the language itself. Which raises the real question. If the DNA can only whisper about deep continuity, what does Basque itself say when you listen closely to its structure and its dialects? If genes don't carry verbs, something else has to. So what actually keeps a language like Euskara anchored in one place for millennia, while other tongues arrive, dominate and disappear? It starts incredibly small. Languages don't really live in peoples or nations. They live in dense little networks of daily interaction, the same 40 faces you see every week, the handful of villages where everyone marries everyone else's cousins, the shepherds who share mountain pastures and gossip, the fishermen who work the same harbour and swear in the same way when a storm comes in. When those networks are tight, local and mostly inward-looking, speech patterns become self-reinforcing. You don't just speak Basque, you speak the variety of Basque that marks you as from this valley, this neighbourhood, this farm. That's the first mechanism, intergenerational transmission inside stable rural communities. If children grow up hearing Euskara at home, with grandparents on the path to the fields, at the village bar, they acquire it without anyone teaching it as a subject. The grammar is soaked into the nervous system by age 4. After that, whatever high-prestige language the school or the state brings in has to fight an uphill battle. It arrives late, it occupies fewer emotional spaces. It doesn't own the lullabies, the curses, the in-jokes. But that only works if several things line up. You need demographic continuity. Not just people living there now, but their children staying, or leaving and then coming back. Traditional Basque society, like many mountain and maritime communities, had economic patterns that favoured this. Land holdings that passed down intact, inheritance rules and marriage strategies that kept at least one child on the ancestral farm. Seasonal migration rather than permanent exile, work that was tied to local geography, particular slopes, particular fishing grounds, particular forests. You also need institutions, even if they don't look like institutions in the modern sense. A village council that deliberates in Basque, a confraternity, a cooperative, a mutual aid society where the meetings, the rituals, the quarrels all happen in Euskara. Fairs, markets, pilgrimages, communal labour days where using the local language isn't a political statement. It's just the obvious default. Those structures create lots of repeated situations where not knowing Basque is a disadvantage, socially or practically, even if you know the empire's language perfectly well. And then there's prestige. Minority languages usually don't die the moment another language arrives. They erode when that outside language gains higher status in the domains that matter most for success: law, religion, administration, commerce, schooling. Think about Latin, then Romance languages, then Castilian, Spanish and French. At various points, these were the languages of courts, tax collectors, bishops, universities, urban guilds. They wrote the contracts. They recorded the land sales. They preached the sermons that counted for salvation. Basque sat outside that prestige zone for a very long time. That sounds like a disadvantage, and in many ways it was. It meant exclusion from some kinds of power, but linguistically it also insulated Basque. If your survival strategy is rooted in small-scale farming, pastoralism, local trade and village politics, you can function entirely in Euskara. You only touch the prestige language at occasional points, paying taxes, confessing sins, dealing with soldiers. The pressure to abandon your mother tongue is real, but it's not constant. And as long as Basque has prestige inside its own domain, associated with toughness, honesty, our people versus outsiders, it can survive that limited contact. When does that balance break? Usually when economic and social life restructure so that success requires constant immersion in the dominant language, when schooling becomes mandatory and monolingual, when industries pull young people into cities where their language is a minority, even on the street, when speaking the minority language starts to signal backwardness, poverty, or lack of education in the eyes of those young people. That's the classic death spiral for small languages worldwide. You can watch it in indigenous languages across the Americas and Australia, in Celtic languages like Cornish and Manx, which lost intergenerational transmission when English became the key to employment and status, in dozens of last survivor tongues in the Caucasus, Siberia, the Himalayas, places where a language survives one valley over, but every paycheck, every hospital form, every diploma lives in Russian, Chinese, Hindi, Turkish. Yet the story isn't linear decline. Prestige can bend the other way. Sometimes the dominant society turns. A minority language becomes fashionable, or politically valuable, or tied to authenticity and heritage. It shows up in literature, radio, then pop songs. Parents who are punished for speaking it start insisting their children learn it. Governments eventually follow, or at least stop fighting it. Basque is a textbook case of this rebound, but it's not unique. Welsh in the UK, Māori in New Zealand, Hawaiian in the US, Sami languages in Scandinavia. Each went through a period of steep decline, followed by strategic revival rooted in exactly those same mechanisms: family transmission, community pride, new institutions and economic niches where the language has real use. The key point is that no single factor explains survival. Geography helps until it doesn't. Rural continuity helps until urbanization hits. High internal prestige protects a language unless external low prestige convinces parents it will harm their children's prospects. Laws can suppress or support, but they always operate through those underlying networks of daily interaction. Basque made it through Romanization, Christianization, feudal kingdoms, early modern state building, industrialization and dictatorship, not because of one magical shield, but because at each stage enough of those reinforcing factors stayed in place. Tight local networks, families transmitting Euskara first, institutions that ran on Basque, and a sense that speaking it was part of being who you were. The mystery isn't that a language can die, that's the norm. The mystery is how a few scattered, historically non-prestige languages like Euskara manage to thread the needle again and again, long enough to meet us in the present. Which leads to the modern twist. Once a language has survived into the age of nation-states, mass media, and compulsory education, how do you move from accidental survival to deliberate preservation? Nation-states don't like messy. They like borders on maps, single flags, official anthems, and preferably one language they can use for courts, railways, tax forms, and school textbooks. The 19th and 20th centuries in Europe were basically a giant machine for turning tangled historical regions into France, Spain, Italy, Germany. The Basque Country sat right in the gears. Industrialization hit the Bay of Biscay like a wave. Iron mines, shipyards, steel mills, ports, cities like Bilbao exploded from provincial towns into heavy industry hubs. Railways cut across those old valleys, rural kids poured into factories where the bosses spoke Spanish, the engineers spoke Spanish, the safety manuals, if they existed, were in Spanish. On the French side, the Third Republic was busy doing something similar. Paris controlled the curriculum. French was the language of citizenship, secular morality, national glory. Basque, like Breton or Occitan, was recast as a patois, a local curiosity you were supposed to grow out of. Inside one lifetime, the structure that had protected Euskara for centuries started to dissolve. The tight village networks frayed as people moved. The economic niches that had run entirely in Basque, shepherding, small farming, local fishing declined or were absorbed into larger markets. Suddenly, success meant mastering the national language every day, not just at tax time, and schools became the spear point for most of the 20th century. Official schooling in both Spain and France was monolingual and hostile. Teachers punished children for speaking Basque in the playground. Parents got the message. If you want your kids to get ahead, you speak to them in Spanish or French at home. Basque might still be the language of the grandparents and the village bar, but crucially, it stopped being the language of first lullabies for a lot of children. Once that intergenerational chain breaks, decline can move frighteningly fast. By the middle of the century, some Basque areas were still solidly Basque-speaking. Others were already shifting to Spanish or French, especially around industrial centres and along key transport routes. The old patchwork of dialects mapped onto a new patchwork of vitality and loss. Then politics poured gasoline on everything. In Spain, the Franco dictatorship after the Civil War crushed regional autonomy and banned Basque from public life. No newspapers, no legal use, no public signage, no broadcasting. In France, the repression was less theatrical but sustained. French as the only legitimate public language, Basque confined to the private sphere. Paradoxically, that combination of material pressure and symbolic banning did two things at once. It accelerated language shift in some places, where fear and stigma turned Basque into something you kept strictly indoors, if at all. But it also intensified its role as a badge of resistance and identity in others. Speaking Euskara could be a quiet act of defiance, a way of saying, "We are still here." By the late 1960s and 70s, another turn began. The same modern forces that had hurt the language, mass education, media, the nation-state, started to be retooled in its favour. At the heart of that shift is something that would have been meaningless to a medieval shepherd: standardization. For most of its history, Basque was fiercely local. Dialects could be very different in pronunciation, vocabulary, even some grammar. A person from the far west and one from the far east could communicate, but it took effort, and there was no single written standard that everyone agreed on. That became a problem as soon as you tried to do modern things in Basque, School textbooks, newspapers, university lectures, bureaucracy, television. You can't print a nationwide science curriculum in 6 or 7 heavily distinct dialects. You need a common baseline. In the late 1960s, the Basque Language Academy, Euskaltzaindia, took the plunge and created Euskara Batua, Unified Basque. It wasn't invented from scratch. It was built mainly from central dialects, smoothed and regularized, with an eye toward intelligibility and teachability. The goal wasn't to erase local speech, but to give Basque a modern skeleton, a standardized grammar, spelling, and core vocabulary that could carry physics lessons, legal codes, and news broadcasts. This changed everything. Suddenly, you could train teachers with a shared norm. You could publish a dictionary, a style guide, a translated Harry Potter. You could create a Basque language media ecosystem that reached across valleys and national borders. University departments could function in Basque. Bureaucrats could file paperwork in Basque. Software could be localized in Basque. The language that had once lived primarily in shepherd huts and fishing boats was now something you could use in a parliament, a lecture hall, a start-up. But standardization always comes with a price tag. For people whose identity is woven into a specific dialect, Biscayan, Guipuzcoan, Lapurdian, Sulatin, Batua can feel like an outsider. It sounds too schoolish or artificial or not really ours. Some elders listen to a newsreader in Euskara Batua and think, that's Basque, but it's not my Basque. There are real tensions here. If you push the standard too hard, you risk flattening the very diversity that shows how deep and old the language is. If you avoid a standard, you risk fragmentation and marginalization in modern domains. Basque communities are negotiating this balance every day. Batua in the classroom and on TV, local dialect at home and in the bar. Switching registers becomes part of being Basque. Schools are now on the front line, but in a very different way than a century ago. From the 1960s onward, grassroots groups began creating ikastolak, Basque medium schools, often illegal at first under Franco. Parents, teachers and activists ran them in borrowed buildings, taught kids everything from math to history in Basque, and turned education into a tool of revival instead of erasure. After Spain's transition to democracy, these schools gained legal status and public support in the Basque autonomous community, and, to a lesser extent, in Navarre. Basque medium or bilingual schooling became a real option. On the French side, similar immersion schools under the CISCA network grew slowly, pushing against a more rigid monolingual framework. Add in Basque language radio, TV channels, music scenes, publishing houses, and you get a transformation. A child in Bilbao or Donostia today can grow up in an environment where Basque is not just the language of grandparents, but of cartoons, YouTubers, pop songs, and science homework. That's the success story. The shadow is that revival can coexist with decline. While urban and semi-urban areas in the Spanish Basque Country have seen a sharp rise in educated, literate Basque speakers, often with Euskara Batua as their main variety, some rural zones, especially in the French Basque Country and parts of Navarre, have continued to lose native speakers. In some villages, the last generation who learned Basque at home is already elderly. The kids might understand a little or learn it at school, but the emotional centre of gravity has shifted. You end up with a pattern that looks almost paradoxical. More total speakers than 50 years ago, more institutional support than ever, but fewer places where Basque is the unmarked, default language of the whole community from cradle to grave. For individuals, this isn't an abstract graph. It's a daily choice architecture. Do you speak Basque or Spanish to your toddler, Basque or French with your colleagues? Do you switch to the majority language as soon as one person in the group isn't fluent? Or do you hold the line and let them catch up? When you text, when you flirt, when you argue with customer service, what language do you reach for? Every one of those micro decisions nudges the future statistics. Parents who themselves learned Basque in school have to decide, is this a heritage subject I respect, or a living language I use even when it slows things down? Young adults have to decide whether speaking Euskara marks them as provincial, as cool, as political, or just as normal. That's the strange new phase for a last survivor language in the 21st century. Its fate is less about whether the empire bans it and more about whether millions of tiny private acts, choosing a school, picking a language on Netflix, greeting your neighbour tilt toward it or away from it. Basque has made it into the era of conscious planning. It has a standard, institutions, media and laws. The question now is whether those tools and the people who wield them can keep this linguistic outlier not just alive on paper, but breathing in the mouths of children. Which brings us back to the mystery. If a language this unusual has managed to survive this long, in this much pressure, what are the chances that somewhere, hidden in the noise of history, its long-lost cousins ever existed? And if they did, where on earth would we even start looking for them? If you want to claim that Basque has cousins, the bar is brutally high. Linguists don't just say these two languages feel similar and call it a family. To prove a relationship, you need two things, and you need them in bulk. First, regular sound correspondences. That means you line up words that mean the same thing in both languages, and you see consistent patterns. Maybe every time proto-language had a P, language A kept it as P, and language B turned it into B. Not sometimes, not when it feels right, always with very specific exceptions you can explain. Second, shared basic vocabulary. Not the flashy words like chariot or king, which travel easily with culture, but the deep core, body parts, close kin, numbers up to 10, basic verbs like to eat, to drink, to sleep. If two languages share a pile of those words in a way that can't be explained by borrowing, and the sounds match in systematic ways, you're in business. You can start reconstructing a shared ancestor. For Basque, that's exactly what we don't have. We have tempting bits and pieces. A Basque word that sort of looks like something in a Caucasian language, or a stray resemblance to an old Iberian inscription. But when people try to build full correspondence systems, sound changes that work across dozens and dozens of words, they run out of material fast. Either the matches fall apart, or they can be explained as loans, or the data on the other side is just too fragmentary. So if Euskara ever had sisters, where did they go? One obvious answer is, they died before anyone could write them down. Imagine early Europe before Indo-European languages took over. Not just Iberia, but all the way across to the Alps and beyond, dotted with small communities speaking unrelated or distantly related languages. If Basque descends from one thread in that tapestry, the rest of the threads might simply have been cut by conquest, by disease, by slow cultural shift, without leaving more than a handful of place names and river names behind. Those are the kind of traces that drive some prehistoric Europe theories. Hydronyms, old water names like the Ebro, the Adour, and many smaller streams, might preserve syllables from languages that otherwise vanished. But names alone aren't enough. You can't do full comparative reconstruction from this river, maybe meant fast 4,000 years ago. Another possibility. The evidence exists, but we've misfiled it. Some of it may be literal, undeciphered or half-understood inscriptions in Iberian, Tartessian, or other Pale scripts sit in museums and archives. We can read the letters, we often don't know what the words mean. If one of those languages was very distantly related to an ancestor of Basque, the relationship might be so eroded by time that the obvious links are gone. You'd need a huge sample of text and a lot of luck to even notice that something systematic was hiding there. Other clues might be hiding in classification rather than in stone. A few tiny surviving languages in the Caucasus, the Pyrenees or elsewhere could, in theory, share deep ancestry with Basque, but after thousands of years of independent change, plus layers of contact with neighbours, the signals would be faint. They could easily be dismissed as isolates in their own regions, or treated as just another quirky branch of a larger family, while any real connection to Basque sits beyond our current time horizon. Because the longer you go back, the worse it gets. Most of the classic language families, Indo-European, Uralic, Afroasiatic, are reconstructed to a depth of maybe 6,000 to 9,000 years, with some confidence. Push much beyond that, and you hit two problems at once. Sound changes accumulate to the point where words become unrecognizable, and core vocabulary gets replaced. The statistical signal of shared origin drops until it's barely distinguishable from coincidence. If Basque split from its nearest relatives 10,000, 12,000, 15,000 years ago, say around the end of the last ice age, the regular correspondences we rely on may simply have been eroded by time. It's not that the relationship isn't there, it's that our methods were never designed to see that far into the fog. This is where some people pin their hopes on computers. There are computational approaches that scan massive word lists, searching for patterns humans might miss. Algorithms can try to cluster languages, infer probable cognates, or model how fast vocabulary changes over time. Used carefully, they can highlight suspicious similarities or rule out connections that are almost certainly spurious. But they don't replace the slow, fussy work of philology. A machine can tell you that Basque Erdin and some other language's word for blue share 3 sounds in a row. It can't tell you whether that's alone a coincidence or part of a regular historical pattern across dozens of meanings. It can't read a damaged inscription, weigh the reliability of a 19th century transcription, or recognize that a word in one language is actually a frozen compound hiding older bits. At best, computational tools act like very fast lanterns sweeping across a dark landscape full of false positives. Humans still have to walk in and examine whatever the beam lands on, which brings us back to the Basque mystery box. Right now, the honest answer is, if Euskara has relatives, we don't know who they are, and we don't know if we'll ever find them. But the story isn't closed. Every new inscription pulled from Iberian soil, every reanalysis of an old undeciphered text, every bigger dataset fed into more refined models has a tiny chance of nudging the needle. One well-documented fragment in a forgotten archive, one bilingual text pairing a known language with an unknown one, could suddenly give us enough data to test relationships that today are pure speculation. Will that happen next year? Probably not, in our lifetimes. Maybe, at all, we genuinely don't know. What we do know is that Basque's status as an isolate is provisional, a label that says more about the limits of our current evidence than about the ultimate truth of its past. It might be the last survivor of a whole vanished family. It might be the lone descendant of a lineage already half erased before farming ever reached Europe. Or it might stay a permanent outlier, an unsolved equation in the corner of the Indo-European classroom. To make sense of that uncertainty, we need to separate what the evidence actually supports from what we'd simply like to be true. So let's actually open the ledger. On one side, the column marked things we really do know. On the other, things we're guessing about, even when the guessers are educated. First line in the known column. Euskara is a language isolate today. That doesn't mean magically unique or fallen from the sky. It means that, with the tools we have and the data we have, we can't demonstrate that it belongs to any established family. Compare it to Indo-European, Uralic, Afroasiatic, anything you like. The regular correspondences and shared core vocabulary just aren't there. Second line, Basque has a documented historical cousin, or at least a very close neighbour, in Aquitanian. The personal names and god names carved in Roman-era stone north of the Pyrenees aren't just vaguely similar to Basque words. In many cases they line up so closely that most historical linguists treat Aquitanian as a stage of Basque, or as a very close sister. This isn't speculation, it's one of the firmest parts of the whole story. Whatever we call it, there was a Basque-like language on both sides of the Western Pyrenees 2,000 years ago. Third line, Basque has been in heavy contact with Latin and later Romance languages for a very long time. You can see it in the vocabulary. Words for church, window, street, Monday, butter, cheese, all with clear Latin or Romance ancestry. You can see it in phonology, sounds and stress patterns nudged by centuries of bilingualism. You can see it in place names, Basque roots sitting under Latin endings, or the reverse. Euskara has not been sitting in a glass box, it has been rubbing shoulders with Indo-European for at least 2 millennia, probably longer. Those are solid. They're backed by inscriptions, by continuous documentation from the Middle Ages onward, by comparative work that has been checked and rechecked. Now the other column. We do not know the ultimate origin of Basque. We don't know which broader macro-family, if any, it might once have belonged to. We don't know whether its deepest ancestors came with the first farmers into Iberia, or were already there with Mesolithic hunter-gatherers and later absorbed agricultural vocabulary from their new neighbours. Genetic work can whisper about population continuity in the region. It cannot tell us what language those people spoke. We also don't know how many sister languages Basque might have had, or exactly when they disappeared. Did it once sit inside a small Pyrenean Iberian family of 3 or 4 languages, wiped out by Celtic and then Latin? Was it one of dozens of unrelated tongues scattered across pre-Indo-European Europe, each as isolated as it is today? Were its closest relatives spoken along the Atlantic coast, or buried somewhere in the Balkans, or up against the Alps? The honest answer is, we don't know, and with current evidence we can't calculate more than possibilities. Timelines are another big blank. We can track written Basque back reliably about half a millennium, and Aquitanian-like names about 2 millennia. Beyond that, it's inference. People will say Basque must be X thousand years old, but that's usually shorthand for the ancestor of Basque was probably spoken here before Indo-European took over. That's a model, not a dated inscription. This is where responsible history has to slam on the brakes. It's tempting to tell a clean story. Basque is the last remnant of old Europe, the tongue of the first Europeans, preserved unchanged from the Ice Age. It's a powerful image, it fits neatly with identity narratives, and it makes for great headlines. It's also far too confident for the evidence we actually have. A more careful framing looks like this. Euskara today is the only surviving non-Indo-European language in Western Europe. It's clearly related to Aquitanian, showing that a Basque-like language once had a wider footprint around the Western Pyrenees. The genetic and archaeological record in that region points to deep population continuity, suggesting that at least some of the people who speak Basque today descend from very old lineages in place. It is reasonable, maybe even likely, to see Basque as the cultural and linguistic heir of populations that were largely erased elsewhere in Europe. Not erased in a single dramatic genocide, but slowly overwritten. Their languages replaced, their names Latinized, their gods renamed, until only scraps survived in rivers and mountains. But that word heir matters. Basque isn't a frozen fossil from 10,000 years ago. It's a survivor that has been changing, adapting, borrowing and reinventing itself across every major shift in European history. The erased populations behind it are real, But they're not a single pristine tribe whose speech we've miraculously preserved. They're a long, messy chain of communities, some lost without trace, some dimly visible through Aquitanian and archaeology, all feeding into the language you can still hear in Bilbao or Bayonne. So we end up with a ledger that looks unsatisfying on purpose. In the known column, isolate status today, Aquitanian links, deep contact with Latin and Romance, strong regional continuity. In the suspected column, a role as one of the last voices of pre-Indo-European Europe, possible extinct relatives, and timelines stretching back into the fog of the Mesolithic or Neolithic. That tension between hard inscription and soft possibility, between what the stones say and what we infer between them, is exactly where this mystery lives. And it's a good moment to pause, because to understand why any of this matters now, why a small language on the edge of Europe has become a symbol, a battleground, and a rallying point, we need to pull back from the deep past and look at the present before we circle back for the final synthesis. Before we dive into that present, one quick thing. If you're the kind of person who likes disappearing inscriptions, lost languages and puzzles exactly like this one, I've put together a book on 12 of the strangest unsolved mysteries in history. Everything from cities that shouldn't exist to technologies that appear centuries too early. You can get it through the website linked in the description, and this week there's a discount running for viewers of this channel. If you want more deep dives like this in a format you can throw in a bag or read offline, that's the place to go. Back to the Basques. This isn't just a quirky footnote about an odd language in a mountain valley. It's a test case for something much bigger, how human cultures vanish, and how, sometimes, they don't. Most of the languages that were once spoken in Europe are gone without a trace, not just untranslated, unrecorded. No inscriptions, no glossaries, no grammars from curious neighbours. Whole systems of thought lived in people's mouths for thousands of years, and then evaporated so completely that we aren't even sure they existed. That is the default outcome for human languages. If you zoom out on world history, it's not Latin becomes French and Spanish that is typical. It's whatever people spoke here in 4000 BCE disappears so thoroughly that we can't even reconstruct a word for water. The Basque case is shocking, not because it's mysterious, but because it's still here at all. Every time a language dies, something irretrievable goes with it. That sounds like a slogan, but it's literally true. Languages are not just different ways of labeling the same set of objects. They encode what a society has cared about, noticed, and argued over for centuries. Which distinctions felt important, which didn't. Think about what we've already seen in Euskara, how it handles kinship terms or place names or borrowed religious vocabulary. Hidden in those patterns are clues about pre-Roman social organisation, about how people carved up land and obligation, about which outside ideas felt alien enough to need special words, and which ones slid in quietly. Lose the language, and those clues collapse into silence. No amount of archaeology can tell you what jokes people made about their in-laws. Genetics can't tell you what metaphors they used for time or death or obligation. Even if you know who was buried where, you don't know what words were spoken over the grave. A language like Basque is a living archive of all of that. And that's why the erased population's framing matters. Basque doesn't sit outside of history like some untouched relic. It has been inside every major upheaval in Western Europe. Romanization, Christianization, feudal kingdoms, early capitalism, modern nation-states, civil wars, industrialization, mass tourism. At every step, people have reached for Euskara, or stepped away from it for specific reasons tied to power, class, faith, and survival. When a Basque speaker in the Middle Ages switched to Latin in a courtroom, and Basque at home, they were making a political and social calculation. When 19th century nationalists promoted Euskara as a badge of identity, that wasn't ancient tribal memory suddenly awakening. It was a modern response to centralizing states and homogenizing schools. When today's parents decide whether their children will attend Basque medium education, they're participating in the latest round of that same long negotiation. So the real stakes of this mystery aren't just where did Basque come from, but what does it mean for a language like this to make it through? If Euskara is, as the evidence suggests, one of the last surviving voices from a Europe that has otherwise been linguistically levelled, then its survival offers a counter-narrative to inevitability. It shows that mass replacement is powerful, but not absolute. That being small or old or different doesn't automatically mean being doomed if certain social conditions line up, if enough people decide that this way of speaking is worth carrying forward. And that folds back on us now. We live in a century where linguistic extinction is accelerating. The same forces that once erased those unnamed neighbours of the Basques, empire, economic pressure, prestige languages, are at work today in every corner of the planet. In that context, Euskara isn't just an archaeological curiosity. It's a case study in how a language can ride through wave after wave of pressure and still be used to order coffee, argue politics, and write new music. So when we ask, what is Basque? We're also asking something much more current. What does it actually take, in practical human terms, for a fragile language to survive the kind of history that erased almost all of its cousins? And can that lesson help us understand which languages will still be here a few centuries from now? Hold that question, because in the final stretch we're going to bring everything together. The genetics, the history, the politics, the mystery, and look at the Basques not as a puzzle to be solved, but as Europe's last surviving thread from a world we've almost completely lost. So where does that leave us? We have a language that, as far as we can currently see, matches nothing else on earth. Not in its grammar, not in its core vocabulary, not in any obvious shared ancestor we can point to and say, there, that's the family. We have historical anchors, but they're late and patchy. Aquitanian names and inscriptions that look Basquish on the Roman frontier. Medieval glosses and place names that confirm continuity in roughly the same corner of Europe. Genetic signals of long-term stability in the Western Pyrenees, but also centuries of mixing and movement like everywhere else. Plenty of contact. Very little kinship. So the best we can say is this. Euskara is, with very high probability, a survivor from a Europe where most of its relatives have been erased. Not an untouched fossil, but a language that has ridden out 2,000 years of conquest, empire, religion, and nation-building, picking up scars and loanwords and new uses as it went. The erased Europe isn't a poetic flourish, it's the baseline. Almost every square kilometre of this continent has hosted languages that left no direct descendants and no clear record. People traded, prayed, cursed, negotiated marriages, and told stories in words we will never hear. And then they were gone. Sometimes the culture shifted to Latin or Greek, or a Germanic dialect. Sometimes the population itself was gradually replaced or absorbed. Sometimes the pressure was slow, tax systems, military service, prestige schools. Sometimes it was brutal, forced resettlements, bans, punishments. All of that happened across millennia to countless communities whose names we don't even know. Yet in one corner on both sides of a mountain chain at the edge of the continent, something hung on, imperfectly recorded, often ignored by elites, sometimes actively suppressed, sometimes celebrated for political reasons that had nothing to do with prehistoric continuity. But alive. You can walk into a school or cafe in Bilbao or Bayonne today and hear a language that almost certainly carries structural and lexical echoes of a world otherwise wiped clean. The words have been remodelled, the syntax has shifted, the speakers' identities have changed over and over, but the lineage of the system itself, the deep grammar, seems to reach back beyond Rome, beyond Celtic migrations, maybe into that Neolithic and Bronze Age patchwork of tongues we've only been able to guess at. That's what makes Euskara a living mystery instead of a solved equation. There are still inscriptions in museum drawers that haven't been re-examined with modern tools. There are half-deciphered scripts like Iberian and Tartessian that might, with future discoveries, yield a clearer sense of who was speaking what and where. There are statistical techniques in historical linguistics that didn't exist 30 years ago, and genetic methods that are getting more precise with every ancient bone we sequence. Any one of those could nudge the story. Maybe some future epigrapher reads a newly dug-up tablet and spots a pattern that really does tie Basque to a lost Iberian language family. Maybe a better reconstruction of prehistoric population movements narrows down when an ancestral form of Euskara could plausibly have arrived in the Western Pyrenees. Maybe none of that happens, and what we're left with is exactly what we have now, a stubbornly isolated language whose deepest roots stay just out of reach. Either way, the value isn't only in solving the puzzle, it's in recognizing that there is quite literally a voice from that erased Europe still arguing about football and politics, still writing novels, still coining new slang. And that leads to a very contemporary question for anyone listening who speaks a minority or endangered language, or cares about one. Which of today's small languages might still be here in 2,000 years, puzzling over our ruins, carrying fragments of our world that never made it into the big international tongues? If you've stayed with this all the way to the end, I'd love to hear from you. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what languages are part of your life, whether that's Basque, Welsh, Kurdish, Quechua, Ainu, or just the dialect your grandparents used that's slowly fading. If you found this interesting, it really does help the channel if you like the video. Drop a comment and subscribe so you don't miss the next deep dive. And if you want to keep going down this rabbit hole of vanished cities, impossible technologies and languages that almost slipped away, remember there's a book on 12 of the strangest prehistoric and early historic mysteries waiting for you on the website linked in the description. Somewhere out there, more pieces of this story are still buried in the ground, in archives, maybe even in patterns no one has noticed yet. Until we find them, Euskara stands where it has stood for centuries, at the edge of Europe, quietly reminding us how much can disappear and how much against the odds can survive.